Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Fisher, and welcome to my world. And in that world, some of the best stories in any medium are built around redemption. There's certainly a unique appeal to those stories, taking unlikable, deplorable characters and having them work hard to redeem themselves. They're not always the main heroes of the story. In fact, some of them start out as outright villains. But even in those cases, a part of us can't help but cheer them on and hope that they do eventually redeem themselves. After all, redemption is a long, arduous process. Like real life, these characters may make mistakes. And some of those mistakes will be downright egregious. But they still try their best to make up for them. And a part of us genuinely wants them to succeed. Because let's face it, we all make mistakes in our lives. Redeeming ourselves is part of how we grow and, ideally, become better people. It's one thing to see some idealized paragon of virtue overcome adversity. It's quite another to see a character transform from some run-of-the-mill asshole into someone we genuinely like. It's a hard story to tell, but one that's especially satisfying when it works. And in the spirit of exploring that impact, I like to single out two characters from two very different stories. BoJack Horseman from the Netflix show of the same name, and Prince Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Both characters come from acclaimed shows, each beloved and celebrated in their own right. Both characters are integral parts of a larger story that unfolds within a unique world. But, most importantly, both characters undergo a major evolution as their story unfolds. But, make no mistake, these are two vastly different characters in terms of background, motivation, and personality. One is an angry, angsty teenager with serious daddy issues. The other is a washed-up sitcom star from the 90s who also lives in a world full of horsemen, dog people, and various animal-human hybrids. Despite these differences, both characters share some distinct similarities. They each start off their respective shows as unlikable, uncaring assholes. But by the end, we understand them more. Who they are, how they got to that point, and why they do what they do. We even grow to like them on some levels. However, I would argue that only Prince Zuko succeeded in his redemption story, and BoJack Horseman did not. And within these contrasting outcomes, we can learn more about what it truly means to find redemption. If you only watch the first 3 episodes of BoJack Horseman, you'd likely surmise that there are few redeeming qualities about the titular horseman. He's a self-centered, narcissistic alcoholic with poor impulse control and little semblance of empathy. By and large, he is the quintessential celebrity asshole. Washed up or not, he managed to get famous years ago, and that fame went to his head in all the wrong ways. But if you can make it past those first few episodes, you learn that there's a lot more to this self-loathing horseman. Yes, he's a washed-up celebrity with toxic habits of self-destruction, but how he got to this point is a long, complex story, one full of bad circumstances and even worse choices. You see, BoJack Horseman did not come from a nurturing environment. His parents were so emotionally abusive that it's hard to blame him for being so messed up. It's also clear early on that BoJack is depressed, unfulfilled, and hates himself to an excessive degree. And being in the glamorous, vice-laden world of Hollywood only compounds his many problems. Becoming rich and famous didn't make BoJack feel better about anything. It just gave him opportunities and excuses to escape his problems. He never really had a reason to take responsibility for damn near anything. It was always just easier for him to numb himself with drugs, sex, and audience applause. When the show begins, he's so stuck in this cycle of self-loathing and depression. And as we learn more about him, we also learn that BoJack did some objectively terrible things to continue that cycle. From betraying his best friend Herb Kazaz, to introducing Sarah Lynn to drugs and alcohol, to sabotaging Todd's space opera, His misdeeds are as egregious as they are damaging. And yet, he does make an effort to improve himself. He knows he's a shitty person, and he wants to be better. He even tries to be better, despite a lifetime of bad decisions and toxic behavior. By the end of the first season, it's clear that BoJack wants to be a better person. And he wants the world to see him as more as that horse from horsing around. In the seasons that follow, BoJack's efforts take him down many paths, some far darker than others. Along the way, he does make some progress, but he also faces setbacks. Serious, soul-crushing setbacks that hurt both him and those around him. It's messy, ugly, and heartbreaking. And it's a big part of why the show is so impactful. But it all comes back to BoJack trying to be a better person than the one we meet in that first episode. And a big part of his struggle involves seeking redemption. But it also happens to be the part of his journey that most complicates his efforts. Avatar: The Last Airbender may be a kid's show, but it's a show with many remarkable characters of varying complexity. Throughout its 3 seasons, nearly every character, including the villains, undergo remarkable growth. And few characters undergo more growth than Prince Zuko. Like BoJack Horseman, he comes off as a generic asshole in the beginning. After nearly a century, the Avatar has returned to bring peace to all nations. And Zuko is the one leading the charge to stop him on behalf of the Fire Nation, the same nation that's propagating this massive war. You really can't get much more antagonistic than that. And in the first few episodes, he doesn't come off as anything more than some angry teenager. He's arrogant, narrow-minded, and temperamental. He's not above attacking an ice village populated by children and old women to get what he wants, and if anyone dares challenge him, he will not hesitate to fight them. Overall, Zuko checks every box of every angry, entitled teenage bully you ever knew in high school. But as the show progresses, we learn there's a lot more to Zuko than his angry adolescent demeanor would imply. Also like BoJack Horseman, Zuko comes from a pretty messed up family. Even though they're royalty, it's not exactly a healthy environment. His father, Fire Lord Ozai, is just an outright tyrant who would give Emperor Palpatine a run for his money. He doesn't just demean and denigrate Zuko at every turn. At one point, he permanently scars Zuko's face because he dared to disagree with his war plans. Even BoJack's parent never did anything like that. Now, on top of the physical scars, Zuko also carries the burden of being a dishonored, exiled royal son. His only hope of ever returning home and gaining some semblance of approval from his father is to capture the Avatar. That does help make sense of his less than friendly demeanor early on, and it also provides an important context to the choices he makes throughout the show. But even without that context, it's abundantly clear that Zuko is not in a healthy environment. He's only ever had a handful of positive influences in his life, most notably his mother and his uncle Iroh. Even though he does his share of bad things, he never comes off as outright evil. Eventually, Zuko becomes a character that you can empathize with, despite being so antagonistic early on. Because in the grand scheme of things, his motivations are understandable. He wants to return home. He wants to redeem himself in the eyes of his nation and his father. And he's willing to make that effort, even if it involves crossing certain lines. His path to redemption is messy, but not quite in the same way as BoJack. But the desire and drive is still there. Zuko has all this potential to be a better person and a better character, but he just can't do that without redeeming himself first. Throughout BoJack and Zuko's respective stories, there are many pivotal moments in their quest for redemption. Within these moments, they often face hard choices that require serious introspection. Sometimes it leads them to doing the right thing. Sometimes it leads to a damaging setback. And in BoJack's journey, there's a lot more of the latter than the former. Not all of it is his fault, but most of it is. His patterns of toxic behavior keep holding him back. And even when it doesn't, the consequences of that behavior usually come back to bite him, often because he refuses to take responsibility until it's too late. But despite those setbacks, BoJack does have moments that show he's capable of real personal growth. One of his most powerful scenes comes in Season 4, in which BoJack finds himself caring for his abusive but ailing mother. This woman, who has levied immense amounts of emotional abuse on him over the years, is declining mentally. BoJack has every possible reason to hate her. Even after her own tragic history is revealed in the episode Time's Arrow, it's entirely understandable that BoJack would resent her, even in her frail state. It would have been easy for BoJack to make his mother miserable during those last few moments. Being such a selfish person, it probably wouldn't have surprised anyone. But he ultimately chooses not to. When that moment does come and his mother has one last round of mental clarity, he has an opportunity to make a better choice. And he does. He managed to finally step out of that toxic cycle and do something his mother never could: show genuine love and comfort. It's a powerful moment, one that the show had been building towards for multiple seasons. And before this, BoJack certainly had opportunities for other moments like this, but he was still so stuck in that self-loathing mindset, making only limited progress at times. And this moment showed that BoJack, for all his awful tendencies, is capable of making the necessary choices to redeem himself. Prince Zuko also shows that he can make those decisions as well. One of the most defining came in Season 2, Episode 7, aptly entitled Zuko Alone. During this episode, Zuko really is at his most vulnerable. He no longer has a fleet of Fire Nation soldiers behind him. He has no arsenal or support of any kind. He doesn't even have Uncle Iroh to offer his sagely wisdom. He is, as the episode title entails, all alone. This brings out the best and worst in Zuko. At his best, we see him contemplating whether he should steal food from a pair of travelers. But when he sees one of them is pregnant, he chooses not to. And when he sees Earth Kingdom soldiers harassing citizens of a small town, he opts to defend them. He does all this while trying to hide his identity as Prince of the Fire Nation, the same nation that's actively warring against the Earth Kingdom, mind you. But his identity does eventually get exposed, and it's largely his fault. Despite having shown little of his usual hostility to these townspeople, they still angrily reject him. They make clear after they learn the truth that they don't want him there. They still ultimately hate him for what he and his nation are doing to their people. In that fateful moment, the script is flipped on Zuko. He suddenly finds himself on the other ends of the battle lines. He's not the aggressor. He's the target. And, despite his ego and arrogance, it hurts him on a personal level. It hits him in a way that he hasn't experienced to this point in the show. But, rather than react with his usual fire-throwing tantrums, he just swallows his bitterness and leaves. He could have lashed out, as he often did in the first season, but he ultimately chooses not to. It's a pivotal moment in that it shows Zuko is capable of being a better person, making the right choices even when it's the hardest. This moment, coupled with the various flashbacks of his youth that led to it, establishes that Zuko isn't a bad guy, especially when you compare him to other members of his family. But he is very impacted by the bad influences around him. It helps set the stage for other critical choices, some good and some not so good. Both Zuko and BoJack get to a point in their respective stories where they prove they can do the right thing for the right reasons. That's an important factor in any redemption story. But in terms of when, how, and why they make these choices, well, that's where the stories of BoJack Horseman and Prince Zuko diverge considerably. Ignore for a moment the fact that BoJack Horseman is geared towards adults while Avatar The Last Airbender is geared towards kids. The themes, with respect to redemption, are still remarkably similar. You have two characters who are in a bad place when the show begins. And as the story unfolds, it's increasingly clear just how much they want and need redemption. However, while BoJack and Zuko both make the effort, only Zuko can actually say he succeeds. And to understand why, it's also necessary to understand the lowest moments these two characters face. If Zuko has a low point in his redemption story, it likely came at the end of Season 2. After making so much progress towards distancing himself from his family, he almost undoes all of it when he chooses to side with his homicidal sister Azula instead of the Avatar. Zuko had every incentive to do the right thing. He could have even healed the scar on his face if he wanted to. He'd come so far to put himself in the best possible position to join Aang, Sokka, and Katara, especially after he freed Appa. But when a chance finally comes along for him to rejoin the Fire Nation and return home to his family, he took it. And Aang, the Avatar, was nearly killed in the process. In terms of redeeming himself, it was a massive setback, and one that did come back to haunt him later on. BoJack Horseman found himself in a similar situation, more than once even. Now, BoJack has many low points over the course of the show. Even at his best, BoJack is never more than a few bad decisions away from falling into old habits. But if there's one choice that haunted him the most over the course of 6 seasons, it was the choice that led to Sarah Lynn's death. By Season 3, it was abundantly clear how much Sarah Lynn means to BoJack. In his old show, he played his adopted daughter. And, just like him, she fell into a self-destructive cycle fueled by drugs, celebrity, and self-hatred. At times, BoJack does try to help her, as if to relive that wholesome feel-good story from their old show. But then, they both relapse. They relapse hard. But it's BoJack Horseman who was the catalyst. He was the one who led Sarah Lynn into one last drug-fueled bender. And, as a result, she died of an overdose. Well, it's not revealed until later seasons just how responsible he was for Sarah Lynn's death. There's never a doubt that he played a part in it. And he knows that on some level. And it eats BoJack up inside for the rest of the show. And when Diane throws it back in his face in Season 5, the full extent of that impact is clear. Both their respective choices put BoJack and Zuko in a dark place. These two characters are never the same after these decisions. But it's what they do in the aftermath that really sets them apart. It also proves to be the decisive factor in terms of why Zuko succeeds in redeeming himself, while BoJack falls short. Because, unlike BoJack, Zuko did not wait for the consequences of his actions to haunt him. When it became painfully clear that he regrets his decision, he actively takes steps to make up for them. That includes going behind the backs of his family, which, mind you, includes a sociopath sister and a tyrant of a father. It also involves him humbling himself before Aang, Toph, Katara, and Sokka, 4 characters he's fought and hurt on many occasions. It is not a pleasant experience, and they understandably doubt him at first. At one point, he's basically alone again, and he has every reason to regress into the same bitter anger that drove him in the first season. But for once, Zuko doesn't fall into that trap again. He keeps on enduring. He resists the urge to just run away from the problems he's caused. Instead, he actively works to fix them. Because of that effort, he doesn't just win the trust of his former enemies, he plays a huge part in ending the war and taking down his father. BoJack never made it that far. He certainly had chances to do what Zuko did, but he never stops running from the consequences of his actions. He'll work on his own problems, but he'll never go out of his way to fix the ones he's caused. As a result, the consequences eventually catch up to BoJack, and it's a big reason why his story is so tragic, whereas Zuko's is so triumphant. There's a lot to be learned from BoJack and Zuko, Time and again, BoJack is a walking cautionary tale. He keeps falling into cycles of self-destruction and depression. Granted, some of that isn't his fault. Like I said earlier, he was the byproduct of some very unfortunate circumstances. But when it comes to the things he could control, he just never made the right choices when it mattered most. He was just too selfish and short-sighted. By contrast, Zuko is a case study in what it takes to make up for your egregious mistakes. Because if Zuko had taken BoJack's approach, he probably would have failed. Either his father or his sister would have eventually exposed the lies he told to get back in their good graces. And after that, he never would have been in a position to redeem himself. And a lot of that is because BoJack's approach is largely driven by selfishness. It is one of his most defining traits, and one his old friend Herb Kazaz called him out on in the first season. BoJack is just never willing to do what's difficult or costly to him personally. He's never willing to go out of his way, make himself vulnerable, and do the right thing. So much of what he does always ends up being self-serving. It's almost never about fixing the problems he's caused. It's about him feeling bad about what he did and trying to make himself feel less guilty. Herb really did say it best. He's a selfish coward who only thinks about himself and doesn't care who he hurts. Those words were harsh, but prophetic in many respects. Because of BoJack's selfishness, he never came clean about the role he played in Sarah Lynn's death until it came back to bite him. He also never came clean about what happened with Penny, the daughter of his old flame Charlotte. And even when he acknowledges the terrible things he does, as he did after he nearly choked Gina to death, he only ever sees his actions in the context of feeling bad about himself. Zuko knows that feeling too. In the famous beach episode of Season 3, he basically goes off. He freely admits that he's angry at himself. He hates himself for what he did. But rather than run from his past decisions or distract himself with other things, he chooses to actively do something about it. He willingly sacrifices everything he's gained in order to make things right. And it's a sacrifice that BoJack never comes close to making. That's because BoJack actively avoids anything that might put whatever he gains at risk, be it his celebrity status or some cushy new job at Wesleyan University. He's never proactive, he's always reactive. And when he faces consequences, his first instinct is to avoid them. And it ultimately costs him dearly later on. Zuko pays a price as well for his choices at first. By choosing to side with the Avatar, he basically surrenders all the power and status he gained as a prince. He makes himself an enemy of his people, his sister, and his own father. He does all of this with no guarantee that Aang and his friends will ever forgive him for his past actions. But that's a chance he's willing to take. And it requires him to be incredibly unselfish, to actually see the bigger picture. That's something his uncle Iroh tried to instill on him from the start of the series. But it's not until the last few episodes of the show that it really sinks in for him. By making these sacrifices, doing the right thing even when it's the hardest choice before him, he gains so much more in the long run. Zuko doesn't just make new friends and earn his uncle's forgiveness. He ultimately becomes the Fire Lord when his father is defeated by the Avatar. It's not a reward as much as it is a vindication. Because despite all Zuko's bad tendencies at the start of the show, he manages to rise above them and be better. BoJack Horseman could have walked a similar path. At one tragic point in the 6th season, he learns from his old boss, Angela Diaz, just how different things could have been. She tells him outright that had he stood by his friend Herb, she would have given in. She'd been bluffing the whole time. If he had just taken that chance and been less selfish, so much could have changed. It's an infuriatingly tragic moment. And BoJack knows in that moment just how close he came to being a less terrible person. But ultimately, as Angela herself points out, he still made that choice. He's still responsible for what happened. And lamenting on what could have been doesn't change that. And at that point, it's just all too clear that it's too late for him to redeem himself. BoJack Horseman and Avatar: The Last Airbender may be vastly different shows from vastly different genres. BoJack and Prince Zuko are also very different characters, but a big part of what makes them so endearing is how much they grow over the course of their respective shows. Who they are when the show starts out is not who they are in the end. What they go through, the triumphs, the tragedies, the bad choices, the good choices, and even the hilarious mishaps in between, it all serves to make them better characters overall. Even though one is a talking horseman and the other is a firebending prince, they're both uniquely relatable. Yes, they do bad things. Yes, they make bad decisions. But they do try to redeem themselves. And even if Zuko is the only one who succeeded, both their stories have an impact that feels genuinely personal. BoJack Horseman, as both a show and a character, is very much a tragedy. He's this very broken, very flawed person. He has all these problems that he struggles with. And at many points, he makes those problems many times worse with his toxic tendencies. He tries to be better. He tries to make up for what he's done in the past. But in the end, he just can't escape his toxic tendencies. By the time he knows what he should have done, it's too late. It still hurts him. He still feels awful about it. Every emotion and upheaval he experiences feels genuine and real. It's a true testament to the quality of the show, as well as Will Arnett's voice acting. But in the end, BoJack just couldn't make the right choices in time. He just couldn't do what Zuko was able to do. Avatar: The Last Airbender has many incredible themes, and Prince Zuko embodies more than most. If BoJack Horseman is a tragedy, then Zuko's story in Avatar is a testament to the power of redemption. He was surrounded by all these bad influences and was encouraged to make so many bad decisions. And at times he did, and he has nobody to blame but himself for that. But when the time came to do the right thing, he made the extra effort. Zuko was willing to fight, sacrifice, and struggle for redemption. It wasn't easy, but it led him to a much better place, especially when compared to BoJack. While BoJack's story didn't end in complete failure, he knows the why and how of his ultimate fate. What he does with that moving forward isn't clear, and what Zuko does with his newfound redemption isn't clear either by the end of the show. But, at the very least, they can both appreciate what it took to be redeemed. It's still a struggle, but, as a wise monkey jogger once said, it gets easier. Every day, it gets a little easier. But you gotta do it every day. That's the hard part. But it does get easier. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.